The last human died on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the wolves had returned to Manhattan. Nobody was there to see them, of course. Nobody to photograph their gray forms slipping between the rusted husks of taxigabs. Nobody to film them drinking from the fountains in Central Park, where the water now ran clear for the first time in 3 centuries. The wolves came down from the north, following some ancient map written in their DNA, reclaiming what had always been theirs. They padded through Times Square, where the billboards had finally gone dark, or silence had replaced the eternal scream of advertising. They marked their territory on the steps of the New York Public Library, and the stone lions, those patient guardians, kept their eternal watch over a kingdom that had changed hands without a single shot fired. The silence was the first thing. Not the absence of human voices, though that was part of it, but the removal of that constant mechanical hum that had wrapped the world in white noise for so long. The highways fell quiet. The factories stopped their churning. The airplanes stayed grounded, slowly rusting in hangars from Heathrow to Hong Kong. And in that silence, other sounds emerged. The sound of wind through grass that grew unchecked. The sound of waves against shorelines no longer held back by seawalls. The sound of birds, so many birds singing in a world that had suddenly become their own. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The Yangtze River ran clean within 6 months. The great brown serpent that had carried the waste of 1 billion people, that had been declared biologically dead in the early years of the 21st century, began to clear. First near its mouth, where the ocean pushed back against the pollution, then gradually upstream. Sediment settled. Chemical loads dispersed into the vastness of the sea. And something impossible happened. Fish returned. Not immediately, and not the same species that had lived there before, but fish nonetheless, swimming up from the ocean, following some imperative older than civilization itself. Small fish at first, then larger ones, then the river dolphins that everyone had thought extinct. They were few, and they were cautious, but they were there, navigating waters that remembered them, even if humans had forgotten. In the Amazon, the chainsaws fell silent mid-cut. Trees that would have been felled stayed standing, their trunks half severed, bleeding sap that would eventually heal into thick scar tissue. The fires that had been set to clear land for cattle ranching burned themselves out with no one to tend them, leaving patches of ash that would become gardens of new growth within a year. The forest, which had been shrinking for so long, stopped its retreat. It held its ground, caught its breath, and then began the slow work of reclamation. Vines crept out from the tree line, reaching toward the cleared spaces. Seeds that had lain dormant in the soil, waiting for light, suddenly germinated in the ashes. Within 5 years, you could barely tell where the clearings had been. Within 20, the forest had swallowed the logging roads entirely, reducing them to slight depressions in the jungle floor, visible only to those who knew what to look for. The nuclear power plants were the first crisis, though no one was alive to call it that. They had been designed to fail safely, more or less, but safe was a relative term. When the cooling systems finally gave out, some after weeks, others after months, the reactor cores began to heat. Some melted down catastrophically, releasing radiation into the surrounding areas. Others simply went quiet, encasing themselves in their own spent fury. The exclusion zones expanded, joining the one around Chernobyl, creating vast territories where humans could not live, but where, paradoxically, wildlife flourished. Deer populations exploded in the absence of hunters. Wolves established territories in the shadows of silent cooling towers. Birds nested in control rooms where warning lights still blinked red for an audience of none. The radiation was there, measurable, dangerous in theory, but nature had made a calculation. A world with radiation, but without humans was still preferable to what had come before. The cities began their transformation slowly, then all at once. Rain was the primary agent of change. It fell on streets that no one swept, on gutters that no one cleared. It pooled in potholes that no one filled, and those potholes became cracks, and those cracks became fissures. Water found its way into foundations, into subway tunnels, into the bones of buildings. It froze and expanded in winter, forcing concrete and steel apart molecule by molecule. The first buildings to fall were the oldest ones, the ones already weakened by decades of deferred maintenance. A brownstone in Boston collapsed into itself one autumn morning, creating a cloud of dust that settled over the empty street. A high-rise in Tokyo shed its glass skin, panel by panel, until it stood naked and skeletal against the sky. But some structures proved remarkably resilient. The great bridges, the Golden Gate, the Brooklyn, the Sydney Harbor stood firm, their cables still taut, their spans still clear. They would stand for centuries, monuments to engineering that outlasted the civilization that had created them. The pyramids of Giza, already ancient, barely noticed the absence of tourists. The Great Wall of China, which had survived dynastic changes and attempted demolitions, simply continued its slow erosion, each year bringing it infinitesimally closer to the earth from which it had been raised. In Rome, the Colosseum stood much as it always had, having already outlived the empire that built it by more than a millennium. It seemed prepared to outlive humanity itself with equal equanimity. The domestic animals faced a crisis of adaptation. Dogs, 15,000 years divorced from their wolf ancestors, struggled without human support. Some of the larger breeds, the shepherds and the huskies, managed to form packs and hunt successfully. They went feral within a generation, their barks becoming howls, their social structures reorganizing along wolf-like lines. Small dogs, pugs, and chihuahuas and toy poodles fared poorly. They were too specialized, too dependent, too far removed from anything resembling a wild animal. They died in large numbers in the first winter, unable to catch prey, unable to defend themselves from larger predators, unable to survive the elements that their ancestors had once weathered with ease. Cats, predictably, did just fine. They were never really domesticated in the first place, only ever tolerating humanity in exchange for easy food and occasional affection. Now they simply returned to the wild state from which they had come, barely skipping a beat. They hunted birds and rodents, as they always had. They slept in sunny spots, as they always had. They lived their lives with the same indifference they had shown to human affairs, unbothered by the great change that had occurred. Cattle and sheep and pigs, the animals that had been most thoroughly reshaped by human intervention, found themselves in a world without fences or feedlots. Some died quickly, unable to fend for themselves. But others, the ones with a bit of wildness left in them, the ones who had been raised on open range or had escaped into feral populations before the end, adapted. Pigs went wild with remarkable speed, developing tusks that their barnyard cousins had been bred not to grow, thickening their hides, becoming dangerous. Within 50 years, there would be wild boar across every continent except Antarctica, snorting through the ruins of subdivisions, rooting through the remains of shopping malls. The ocean began its healing at the surface and worked its way down. The great garbage patches, those floating islands of plastic that had accumulated in the gyres, began to break apart. UV radiation from the sun made the plastic brittle, and waves fragmented into smaller and smaller pieces. Some of it sank. Some of it washed ashore on empty beaches, creating tide lines of bottle caps and shopping bags and unidentifiable fragments of polymer. But without new plastic being added, the patches began to dissipate. It would take centuries for all the plastic to truly degrade, and even then, microplastics would remain in the ocean's chemistry like a memory of what humans had done. But the visible accumulations, the horror show of garbage that had floated on the surface, began to fade. Fish populations, which had been pushed to the brink by industrial fishing, began a slow recovery. Bluefin tuna, whose numbers had dwindled to a tiny fraction of their historical abundance, found the ocean suddenly empty of long lines and nets. They spawned unmolested in the Mediterranean. Their numbers grew. Cod returned to the Grand Banks, where they had once been so thick that sailors claimed you could walk across the water on their backs. That density would never return. The ocean had changed too much, but cod swam there again nonetheless. Whales, no longer dodged by ships or caught in nets, expanded their ranges. Their populations grew slowly, as populations of large animals do, but they grew. The ocean would never be what it had been before industrial fishing, but it could be something new, something viable, something alive. The coral reefs went through a period of crisis before they began their recovery. The ocean temperatures remained elevated. Humans had put enough carbon into the atmosphere to ensure warming for centuries, and that warmth continued to stress the coral. Bleaching events occurred. Reefs that had already been damaged continued to die, but then, gradually, something shifted. The coral that survived was the coral that could tolerate the warmer water. It reproduced. Its offspring, selected by this new environment, spread. New species of coral emerged, evolved for a warmer ocean. The reefs began to recover, but they were different reefs, built by different coral, home to different fish. They were not worse, necessarily, but they were changed. They were the reefs of the Anthropocene, built on the bones of what came before. Plant life responded to the absence of humans with explosive growth. Vacant lots that had been kept clear by mowing and herbicides suddenly filled with vegetation. In temperate zones, the sequence was predictable. Grasses and weeds first, then shrubs, then fast-growing trees like poplars and birches, then eventually the slower, longer-lived species, oaks and maples and beeches, that would constitute the mature forest. In tropical areas, the succession happened faster, jungles swallowing human structures within years rather than decades. In the American South, kudzu, that invasive vine from Japan, went absolutely rampant, covering entire towns in green, turning abandoned cars and buildings into abstract sculptures of vegetation. Forests that had been clear-cut began to regrow. The process was faster than most people would have expected. A clear-cut forest in the Pacific Northwest would have young trees within 5 years, a recognizable forest within 20, and something approaching old growth within 200 years. It wasn't the same as the original forest. The soil had been compacted by logging equipment. Invasive species had established themselves. The specific composition of tree species had changed, but it was a forest nonetheless. Elk returned to ranges they had been absent from. Wolves followed the elk. The trophic cascades that ecologists had identified began to play out in reverse, systems rebalancing themselves in the absence of human interference. The Sahara Desert, which humans had expanded through overgrazing and poor agricultural practices, began a slow retreat. Without goats and cattle eating every bit of vegetation at the desert's edge, plants gained a foothold. They stabilized soil. They retained water. They created microclimates that allowed other plants to establish. The process was glacially slow, but it was happening. The same occurred at the edges of the Gobi, the Atacama, the deserts of Australia. The expansion of deserts, which had seemed inevitable, reversed itself. In the Arctic, the warming that humans had set in motion continued. Permafrost melted, releasing methane that had been trapped for millennia. That methane accelerated warming, creating a feedback loop that would take centuries to resolve. Ice sheets continued to retreat. Sea levels continued to rise, flooding coastal areas that would not see humans again. But the Arctic ecosystem adapted. Shrubs moved north into the tundra. Trees followed the shrubs. The boreal forest crept northward, claiming territory that had been treeless for 10,000 years. Caribou herds, no longer hunted or disrupted by industrial development, flourished. Polar bears, paradoxically, struggled. They were specialized for a world of sea ice, and that world was disappearing. Some populations died out. Others interbred with grizzly bears, creating hybrid animals that could survive in a changing Arctic. Evolution, which had been disrupted by the speed of human-caused change, now had time to work. The Great Plains of North America saw a return of grass. The agricultural fields, without planting or harvesting, grew up in weeds for a few years. But gradually, native grasses big bluestem, switchgrass, Indian grass reasserted themselves. They grew from seeds that had survived in the soil, waiting. Within decades, the plains began to resemble their pre-agricultural state. Bison, which had been maintained in small populations in parks and preserves, broke out of their enclosures. They wandered east and west and north, finding the fences broken down, the barriers gone. Their populations exploded. Within a century, there would be millions of bison again, moving in great herds across grass that grew as high as a horse's belly. The return of apex predators reshaped ecosystems in ways both predictable and surprising. Wolves, as they moved into territories humans had cleared them from, reduced deer populations, which in turn allowed forest understories to recover. In areas where deer had been overbrowsing, eating every seedling, preventing forest regeneration, the return of wolves created a trophic cascade. Forests regrew. Streams that had been eroded by too many deer hooves stabilized. Birds that nested in understory vegetation returned. The whole ecosystem shifted, all because wolves were killing some fraction of the deer population. Mountain lions expanded their range eastward, moving into areas they had been extirpated from. They took down deer in the suburbs of Philadelphia, in the ruins of Detroit, in the overgrown parks of Atlanta. Their presence rippled through the system. Raccoons and opossums, which had thrived in suburban environments, suddenly had a predator to fear. Their populations declined. That decline affected other species. Fewer raccoons meant fewer raids on bird nests, which meant more successful bird reproduction. Grizzly bears moved out of their remaining strongholds in the northern Rockies and began reclaiming territory. They wandered through Yellowstone, through the Bob Marshall Wilderness, then farther, into areas they had not been seen in more than a century. They appeared in the Black Hills. They were spotted in the Bighorns. Eventually, they would make it to the Great Plains, where their ancestors had lived alongside bison and wolves before humans pushed them out. The return of predators created a world that was more dangerous, at least from a human perspective, but also more balanced. Herbivore populations were kept in check by predation rather than starvation. Ecosystems functioned more efficiently. Energy flowed through food webs in ways that had been disrupted for centuries. Rivers, released from their concrete channels and earthen levees, began to meander again. They found new paths, creating oxbows and wetlands. The Mississippi, which had been confined to a narrow channel to facilitate shipping, broke out during floods and spread across its floodplain. It created new distributaries, new routes to the Gulf of Mexico. The delta, which had been eroding for decades as sediment was trapped behind dams and prevented from replenishing the land, began to rebuild. Without the dams, sediment flowed freely again. The river deposited millions of tons of soil each year, countering the subsidence and sea level rise that had been drowning the delta. New land formed. Marshes that had turned to open water reversed course and became marshes again. Dams began to fail within decades. They were designed with a lifespan in mind, and without maintenance, they reached the end of that lifespan. Some failed catastrophically, releasing walls of water that scoured valleys and then subsided, leaving new landscapes. Others simply eroded slowly, their spillways wearing away, their structures weakening until they were no longer barriers, but merely obstacles around which water flowed. Reservoirs drained. The valleys they had flooded emerged, muddy and barren at first, then gradually revegetating. Salmon, whose migration routes had been blocked by dams for more than a century, swam upstream again. They reached spawning grounds their ancestors had used, high in the mountains, in streams that ran cold and clear. The Colorado River, which had been bled dry by irrigation and rarely reached the sea anymore, began flowing to its mouth again. The delta, which had been reduced to a dry wasteland of cracked mud and invasive plants, flooded. Water spread across the delta, creating wetlands, attracting birds. Within years, millions of birds were using the delta again during migration, stopping there to rest and feed in marshes that had been absent for nearly a century. In the cities, water found new paths. Subway tunnels flooded first, filling with groundwater that had been held back by constant pumping. The tunnels became underground rivers, flowing toward the ocean or into the aquifer. Basements filled. Foundations weakened. Buildings began to lean and then topple as the ground beneath them shifted. In low-lying areas, entire neighborhoods flooded, creating urban wetlands. Rats and cockroaches, those quintessential urban species, found their habitat transformed. Some adapted, others did not. The populations that had exploded in the presence of human waste declined to more natural levels. Invasive species, those plants and animals that humans had accidentally or intentionally spread around the world, began a complex dance of adaptation and competition. Some thrived in the absence of human management. Kudzu, rabbits in Australia, cane toads in the tropics, these species exploded in population. But without continued human disruption creating empty niches, they also faced increased competition and predation. In some ecosystems, invasive species became naturalized, becoming permanent parts of the ecology. In others, they declined as native species outcompeted them, or as predators learned to exploit them as a food source. European starlings, introduced to North America by a man who wanted every bird mentioned in Shakespeare to live in Central Park, remained common. But their populations were checked by hawks and owls that had learned to hunt them. They became just another bird, no longer the overwhelming presence they had been when their populations were subsidized by human agriculture. The ruins of agriculture presented unique environments. Orchards of apple and peach trees, unpruned and unfertilized, became wild tangles. The fruit they produced was smaller and less sweet than the cultivated varieties, reverting toward their wild ancestors. Bears gorged on them in the fall. Deer browsed the low branches. The trees spread beyond their original plantings, hybridizing with wild relatives, creating new varieties that were neither fully domesticated nor fully wild. Vineyards, those carefully tended rows of grapevines, grew out of control. Vines spread across the ground and climbed into trees. The grapes became smaller, more tart, their flavor less refined, but perhaps more complex. Birds ate them. Fermentation happened on the ground where fruit fell, and various animals learned to appreciate the mild intoxication that came from eating fermenting grapes. Deer were occasionally seen staggering away from old vineyards, drunk on the fruit. Agricultural fields that had been treated with pesticides and herbicides went through a period of recovery as those chemicals degraded. The first plants to grow back were often weeds, opportunistic species that could tolerate contaminated soil. But gradually, as rain washed chemicals away and microorganisms broke down toxic compounds, more diverse plant communities established themselves. The process could take decades, but it happened. Fields that had been sterile monocultures became meadows, then forests. The Great Barrier Reef, that vast structure of living coral off the coast of Australia, went through cycles of bleaching and recovery. The ocean remained too warm for optimal coral health, and acidification continued to make it harder for coral to build their calcium carbonate skeletons. But without the additional stresses of pollution, overfishing, and physical damage from boats and divers, the reef persisted. It changed. Certain species of coral became more common while others retreated, but it endured. New ecological relationships formed. Fish that had been rare became common. Others disappeared. The reef was not the same as it had been, but it was still there, still humming with life. Antarctica remained the most isolated continent, changed the least by the absence of humans, because it had been changed the least by their presence. The research stations, abandoned, were gradually buried by snow or blown away by katabatic winds. Penguins continued their annual migrations, gathering in enormous colonies, utterly indifferent to the fact that no scientists were there to count them. Seals basked on ice floes. Whales fed in the Southern Ocean, which had become slightly more hospitable as whaling ceased and as the moratorium on fishing around Antarctica meant prey species were more abundant. But even Antarctica was not immune to the changes humans had set in motion. The West Antarctic ice sheet continued its slow collapse, a process that would unfold over centuries. As it melted, sea levels rose. Coastal areas around the world flooded. The Maldives disappeared entirely, becoming a shallow bank beneath the waves. Bangladesh lost a third of its landmass. Florida's southern tip vanished. New Orleans, Venice, Bangkok, these cities were slowly claimed by the sea. The water rose centimeter by centimeter, year by year, flooding buildings from the bottom up, turning streets into canals and canals into open water. Fish swam through Times Square. Sharks cruised what had once been Wall Street. The ocean, which humans had pushed back for so long, reclaimed what had always been its territory. The sky changed. Without the contrails of airplanes, without the emissions from millions of cars and trucks and ships, the atmosphere began to clear. Particulate matter settled out. Smog that had hung over cities for decades dissipated. In Los Angeles, the mountains became visible from downtown every day, not just after a rare rainstorm. In Beijing, blue sky became the norm rather than the exception. Stars that had been invisible in light-polluted skies appeared. The Milky Way stretched across the night sky, above abandoned cities, its ghostly light illuminating ruins that would soon be reclaimed by the forest. The climate continued to warm for centuries. Humans had put enough carbon into the atmosphere to ensure that. But without continued emissions, the rate of warming slowed. The feedback loops that scientists had feared runaway methane release, total loss of ice sheets, collapse of ocean currents occurred, but did not spiral completely out of control. The planet warmed, then stabilized, and very slowly began to cool as the excess carbon was gradually absorbed by the ocean and by the recovering forests. It would take tens of thousands of years for atmospheric carbon to return to pre-industrial levels. The planet had been pushed into a new stable state, warmer than before, with higher sea levels, with different patterns of rainfall and vegetation. It was not the same world it had been, but it was a world that could support life. Radiation from the failed nuclear power plants created exclusion zones, but those zones became refuges. In the forests around Chernobyl, scientists had observed before the end that wildlife was thriving despite measurable radiation exposure. The same pattern repeated itself. Wolves, lynx, bears, eagles, they all lived in the shadow of the destroyed reactors. Their populations limited more by habitat and prey than by radiation. They developed cancers at slightly higher rates than populations outside the exclusion zones, but the absence of humans more than made up for it. They lived, they bred, they died. The radiation was a cost they paid, one they never knew about, one that mattered less than the abundance of prey and the absence of hunters. The cities became jungles of a unique sort. Skyscrapers sprouted trees from their upper floors, where wind-blown seeds found purchase in accumulated soil. Vines climbed facades, their roots working into mortar and concrete, slowly pulling buildings apart. Rats and pigeons, those quintessential urban species, were joined by hawks and owls. Peregrine falcons, which had adapted to nesting on skyscrapers, continued to do so even as those skyscrapers crumbled. They perched on window ledges and raised their young, teaching them to hunt the pigeons that flocked in the ruins below. Central Park, that great rectangle of green in the heart of Manhattan, became true wilderness. The carefully tended lawns went to seed. The trees, no longer pruned, grew wild. The lake, no longer cleaned and maintained, became murky and then clear again as an ecosystem established itself. Fish appeared, their eggs likely carried in on the feet of ducks. Turtles basked on logs. Herons stalked the shallows. Within 50 years, you could stand in Central Park and not see a single human-made object. The city was still there, just beyond the tree line, but the park had been reclaimed. In the suburbs, the transformation was fastest of all. Suburban homes, those wood-frame structures that had been built quickly and cheaply, decayed rapidly without maintenance. Roofs leaked, water damage spread, mold bloomed. Within a decade, most suburban homes were uninhabitable. Within 3 decades, many had collapsed. The lots they had occupied filled with vegetation. Driveways cracked and buckled, becoming streams during rain. Cul-de-sacs filled with sediment and plant life, becoming ponds and meadows. The suburbs, that great experiment in spreading humanity thinly across the landscape, dissolved. The landscape reasserted itself. Shopping malls, those cathedrals of consumerism, became enormous greenhouses. Skylights, designed to let in natural light, allowed rain to enter once they broke. The interior spaces flooded. Seeds blew in. Forests grew inside malls, trees reaching toward the skylights, their roots cracking the concrete floors. In the Pacific Northwest, where rainfall was abundant, malls became indoor rainforests, humid and green, inhabited by deer and raccoons that wandered in through broken entrances. Parking lots, those vast expanses of asphalt, took longer to break down than most structures. But they too succumbed eventually. Asphalt is just petroleum and aggregate, and petroleum degrades. Cracks appeared, water infiltrated. Freeze-thaw cycles widened the cracks. Plants rooted in them. Within a century, most parking lots had fragmented into rubble, with plants growing between the fragments. Within 2 centuries, they were barely recognizable, just areas of disturbed soil with a higher concentration of gravel than the surrounding landscape. Highways became linear forests. Without maintenance, they degraded quickly. Potholes appeared, filled with water, became ponds. Overpasses, their rebar rusted and weakened, collapsed. Trees sprouted in the median, then spread across the lanes. Within decades, you could barely trace the path of the interstate. Within a century, it was gone. Just a slight clearing in the forest where trees grew less densely, where the soil was still compacted and poor. Airports, those vast flat expanses of concrete runway, took longer to reclaim. But even concrete has a lifespan. It cracked. Plants found those cracks. Runways became fields of flowers. Control towers, those tall structures designed for visibility, became nesting sites for hawks and falcons. Hangars, vast echoing spaces, housed colonies of bats that flew out at dusk in great spiraling clouds. A border wall between the United States and Mexico, that barrier that had been built and rebuilt and expanded, became a peculiar artifact. In some places, it fell quickly, toppled by floods or undermined by erosion. In others, it stood for decades, a rust-streaked monument to fear and division. But it was porous. Animals moved through gaps and over it and under it. Plants grew up against it, eventually over it. It became less a barrier and more a linear habitat, a place where species from both sides mingled and interbred. Nuclear weapons, those devices humans had built to destroy themselves, sat in their silos and bunkers in submarines. Warheads required maintenance to remain functional, and without that maintenance, they slowly became inert. Tritium decayed. Electronics degraded. Conventional explosives broke down. Within decades, Most nuclear weapons were no longer capable of detonation. They remained radioactive, dangerous to handle, but they were no longer functional as weapons. They became, in essence, very expensive dirty bombs, hazardous waste that would require careful management to clean up if anyone had been around to do so. But no one was. They sat in their bunkers, slowly decaying, a threat that diminished year by year. The International Space Station, humanity's outpost in orbit, continued to circle the Earth for a time. Its orbit decayed slowly, pulled down by the thin atmosphere at its altitude. Eventually, after years of silent operation, its solar panels still generating power, its systems still running on automatic, until they failed one by one, it fell. It broke apart on re-entry, most of it burning up in the atmosphere, some pieces falling into the ocean. A few fragments, scorched and twisted, landed in unpopulated areas, becoming strange artifacts for no one to find. The satellites in higher orbits remained, circling endlessly. Geostationary satellites, parked in that special orbit where they matched Earth's rotation, stayed in place for millennia. They became, in effect, a new ring around the planet, invisible to the naked eye, but there nonetheless, a memorial to a species that had briefly reached for the stars before disappearing. Mars rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance and the others, continued their missions for a time. They operated on automatic, following their programming, sending data back to Earth where no one received it. Eventually, their systems failed. Dust accumulated on their solar panels. They shut down, becoming monuments on a distant world, markers of humanity's brief moment of exploration. The moon retained the footprints left by Apollo astronauts. Without wind or rain to erode them, they would remain for millions of years, ghostly impressions in the lunar dust, evidence that someone had been there once. Back on Earth, the process of transformation continued. Each year brought new changes, some subtle, some dramatic. A skyscraper collapsed in São Paulo, creating a cloud of dust that spread across the city. A pride of lions was seen in Paris, having somehow migrated from Africa or escaped from a zoo and bred. Elephants appeared in Spain, descendants of animals that had broken free from captivity. They found the climate suitable and the vegetation abundant. Within a century, there would be established elephant populations in southern Europe, the first elephants on that continent in thousands of years. The seasons continued their ancient rhythm. Spring brought new growth. Summer brought heat and thunderstorms. Autumn brought color and harvest for those animals that stored food. Winter brought cold and hardship. Animals died and were born. Plants germinated and grew and died and decayed. The great wheel turned, as it had always turned, but now without human hands trying to stop it or speed it up or divert it to their purposes. The story of Earth became the story of succession, of ecological recovery, of adaptation and evolution. It became the story of systems rebalancing themselves, of trophic cascades and keystone species, of rewilding on a global scale. It was not a return to some pristine past. The planet had been changed too fundamentally for that, but it was a moving forward into something new, something that incorporated both the ancient patterns of life and the novel elements that humans had introduced. Some species went extinct in the chaos of transition. Domestic dogs that could not adapt. Crop plants that could not survive without cultivation. Animals that had been too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions that no longer existed. But overall, biodiversity increased. As ecosystems recovered, they became more complex. More niches appeared, and species evolved or migrated to fill them. The rate of extinction, which had been accelerating toward levels not seen since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, slowed and then reversed. Life, which had been under assault, began to flourish again. The oceans saw the return of giants. Without whaling, whale populations grew. Blue whales, the largest animals to ever live on Earth, swam in numbers not seen since before industrial whaling. Their songs echoed through the ocean basins, traveling for hundreds of miles. They fed on krill in the Antarctic waters, each whale filtering tons of the tiny crustaceans from the water each day. Their feces, rich in iron and other nutrients, fertilized the surface waters, creating blooms of phytoplankton that fed the krill that fed the whales. The great circle continued. Kelp forests, which had been damaged by warming waters and sea urchin outbreaks, began to recover in some areas. Otters, no longer hunted for their fur, expanded their populations and controlled the urchins. The kelp grew thick, creating underwater forests that sheltered fish and invertebrates. These forests became nurseries for species that had been in decline, giving them shelter and food. Sharks, those ancient predators, continued their role as apex predators of the ocean. Without fishing pressure, their populations stabilized and then grew. Great whites, hammerheads, tigers, makos, they patrolled the oceans, keeping prey populations in check, maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. They were not mindless killers, despite their reputation, but sophisticated predators that played a crucial role in ocean health. On land, megafauna began a slow resurgence. Elephants in Africa and Asia saw their populations increase as poaching ceased. They modified their environments, knocking down trees, creating clearings that benefited other species. They dug waterholes in dry season that other animals used. They were ecosystem engineers, and their recovery had ripple effects throughout their habitats. Rhinos, pushed to the brink of extinction by demand for their horns, began to recover. It would take centuries for their populations to return to historical levels. They reproduced slowly, and they had been reduced to very small numbers, but they were no longer declining. They were holding on, and then slowly increasing. Each new calf was a victory, a step back from the edge of oblivion. Gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, the great apes, humanity's closest relatives, found their habitats no longer shrinking. The logging stopped. The bushmeat trade ended. They were left alone in their forests. Their populations remained small, constrained by slow reproduction and limited habitat, but they were stable. They continued their lives, unaware that their primary threat had vanished. They foraged and socialized, and raised their young in forests that were slowly expanding again. Tigers recolonized parts of their former range. They moved out of India, spreading into areas of Southeast Asia, and even into Central Asia, where they had been absent for decades. They were adaptable predators, capable of living in a wide range of habitats as long as they had sufficient prey and cover. With both available, they expanded. Within centuries, tiger populations across Asia had recovered to something approaching their historical abundance. In Africa, lions expanded their range. They moved out of their remaining strongholds in East and Southern Africa, spreading into West Africa, into areas they had been eliminated from during the colonial period. They established prides. They hunted. They held territories against other predators. The great carnivores of Africa, lions, leopards, cheetahs, wild dogs, hyenas, reached a new equilibrium, one that shifted and changed with local conditions. But that was fundamentally more stable than what had existed during the period of human dominance. Birds flourished. Many species of birds had been in decline, threatened by habitat loss, pesticide use, and collisions with buildings and windows. With those threats removed or reduced, bird populations rebounded. Songbirds that had been common only in remote areas appeared in cities. Raptors nested on skyscrapers and hunted in the ruins. Waterfowl used the new wetlands that formed in river floodplains and flooded urban areas. The skies filled with wings. The air filled with song. Insects, those crucial pollinators and decomposers, recovered from the onslaught of pesticides. Bee populations, which had been collapsing due to a combination of disease, pesticides, and habitat loss, stabilized. Butterflies and moths, whose populations had been declining, rebounded. The night air was once again thick with insects, feeding the bats that hunted them, pollinating flowers under the cover of darkness. Amphibians, which had been suffering from a global decline due to habitat loss, pollution, disease, and climate change, had a more mixed recovery. Some species went extinct in the chaos of transition. Others found new habitats in the changing world. Frogs called from newly formed wetlands. Salamanders bred in vernal pools that appeared in the depressions left by collapsed buildings. It was not a full recovery. Too many species had been lost, and the fungal diseases that had been devastating amphibian populations worldwide continued to spread, but it was not total collapse either. The great forests of the world, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, the forests of Southeast Asia, the boreal forests of Canada and Russia stopped shrinking and began to expand. They sent out tendrils into areas that had been cleared for agriculture. They reclaimed logged areas. They spread into the tundra as the climate warmed. These forests were the lungs of the planet, pulling carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in wood and soil. Their recovery was slow, but significant. Each year, they pulled more carbon from the air. Each year, they sequestered more of the excess that humans had released. Grasslands, which covered vast areas of the planet and which had been converted to cropland or overgrazed into deserts, began to recover. The prairies of North America regrew. The steppes of Central Asia filled with grass again. The African savannas, relieved of overgrazing pressure, thickened. These grasslands supported herbivore populations that had been depleted. Bison on the American plains, antelope in Central Asia, wildebeest and zebra and gazelle in Africa. Their populations grew, limited now primarily by predation and disease rather than hunting and habitat loss. Wetlands, those crucial ecosystems that filter water, provide habitat and buffer against floods, began to reappear. River deltas that had been drained for agriculture flooded again. Inland wetlands formed in low areas where drainage systems had failed. Mountains remained largely unchanged, at least in terms of human impact. They had been less developed than lowland areas, and what development existed decayed like everything else. Deserts, those harsh environments where water was scarce and life was tenacious, continued as they had always been. They were perhaps the least changed of any ecosystem, having been the least impacted by humans in the first place. The rivers of the world, those arteries that carried water from mountains to ocean, ran clear for the first time in centuries. You could see to the bottom of rivers that had been opaque with sediment and waste. Lakes, those great pools of fresh water that dotted the continents, underwent similar transformations. The invasive species remained. You can't unring that bell, but without continued pollution and disruption, the lakes found a new balance. Mountain glaciers continued their retreat, a process that had been underway for more than a century. They melted, feeding streams and rivers, altering the hydrology of entire regions. Some disappeared entirely, leaving behind bare rock and piles of moraine. Others persisted in the highest, coldest areas, shrinking but enduring. The meltwater they provided decreased over time, which meant that rivers fed by glaciers saw their summer flows decline. This altered the ecosystems downstream, favoring species that could tolerate lower flows and warmer water. Sea ice retreated. The ice cap covering the Arctic Ocean thinned and shrank, eventually becoming seasonal rather than permanent. Polar bears, those icons of the Arctic, faced an uncertain future. Some populations died out. Antarctica remained colder, more stable, more resistant to change than the Arctic. The continent would not be ice-free for tens of thousands of years, if ever. Life in Antarctica continued much as it had: penguins, seals, whales, seabirds. The auroras continued their silent displays, flickering across the polar skies. Green and red and purple curtains of light danced above the empty tundra, above the frozen ocean, above the ice sheets. No one watched them anymore, but they continued nonetheless, driven by solar wind and Earth's magnetic field, indifferent to the presence or absence of observers. The moon rose and set, pulling the tides. The tides washed over beaches where no footprints appeared. The rhythm of the tides continued, as it had for billions of years, as it would for billions more. Meteors continued to fall, burning up in the atmosphere, occasionally making it to the ground. A large meteor could still cause devastation, wiping out species, altering the climate. But the odds of such an impact were low, measured in millions of years. For now, the meteors were just shooting stars, streaks of light across the night sky, witnessed only by animals that had no concept of what they were seeing. The sun rose and set, its light falling on forests and oceans and deserts and mountains. It powered photosynthesis, drove the weather, warmed the planet. It was the ultimate source of energy for almost all life on Earth, and it continued its work regardless of what happened on the planet's surface. In 5 billion years, it would expand into a red giant and consume the Earth, but that was a problem for the distant future. For now, it was simply the sun, reliable, constant, the heart of the solar system. Seasons turned. Years passed. Decades, centuries. The planet healed, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. The scars humans had left remained visible for a long time. The layer of plastic in the geological record, the spike in atmospheric carbon, the radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests and power plant failures, the mass extinction event, these would be detectable for millions of years. Future geologists, if they ever existed, would look at this layer and see a brief, intense period of disruption. They might call it the Anthropocene, the age of humans. They would see the mark humans left on the planet, a mark that would persist long after every trace of human civilization had crumbled to dust. But above that layer, in the strata deposited after humans, there would be evidence of recovery, increased biodiversity, the return of species, the re-establishment of ecosystems. The geological record would show not just the wound, but the healing. It would show that life persisted, adapted, continued. Life had survived far worse extinctions than the one humans caused. It had survived the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. It had survived the great dying at the end of the Permian, when more than 90% of all species went extinct. It would survive this as well. Evolution continued, of course. It never stopped. Animals adapted to the new conditions. Plants evolved new strategies. Species split and diverged. New species emerged from the crucible of change. A few thousand years after humans disappeared, there would be species that had never existed before, species that had evolved to fill niches created by the absence of humans or by the changes humans had wrought. Evolution worked with what it had, shaping life to fit the environment, creating diversity from the raw material of genetic variation and selection pressure. The world that emerged was not the world that had existed before humans, but it was not the world humans had left either. It was something new, something in between. It was a world shaped by 4 billion years of evolution, 300 years of intense human impact, and now an indeterminate period of recovery and adaptation. It was a world where the rivers ran clean, where forests grew, where cities once stood, where whales sang in unpolluted oceans and wolves howled in the ruins of civilization. It was a world without humans, but it was not a dead world. It was, perhaps, more alive than it had been in a very long time. The pressure that had been suppressing biodiversity, that had been simplifying ecosystems, that had been driving species to extinction at unprecedented rates, that pressure had been removed. Life, given room to breathe, had responded. It had recovered. It had adapted. It had endured. And in the silence, in the absence of human voices, other voices could be heard. The howl of wolves in Manhattan, the call of loons on lakes in Wisconsin, the buzz of insects in meadows that were once suburbs, the songs of birds in forests that were once farmland. These voices had always been there, but they had been drowned out by human noise. Now they could be heard again, carried on wind that no longer smelled of exhaust and industry, echoing through valleys that no longer echoed with machinery. The Earth continued its ancient rotation, spinning through space, orbiting the sun, part of a solar system, part of a galaxy, part of a universe so vast that the entire drama of human existence was less than a footnote. On this small planet, life continued. It had persisted for more than 3.5 billion years. It had weathered mass extinctions, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts. It had evolved from single cells into the magnificent diversity of forms that covered the planet. And it would continue, with or without humans, for as long as the sun continued to shine and the earth continued to turn. The story of Earth after humans was not a story of ending, but of continuation. It was not a story of death, but of life finding a way, as life always had. It was the story of a planet healing, of systems rebalancing, of the great wheel of nature turning without the hand of humanity trying to stop it or control it or bend it to their will. It was the story of what happens when nature is given time and space to recover. And perhaps, in some distant future, if intelligence ever arose again on this planet or visited from somewhere else, they would find evidence of what had been. They would find the ruins, gradually being eroded and buried. They would find the layer in the rock that marked human presence. They would find plastic embedded in stone, radioactive isotopes in the soil, changes in the climate record. They might wonder what kind of species had done this, had risen so high and fallen so completely. They might study the remains and try to understand. But for now, there was no one to study, no one to understand, no one to remember. There was only the wind in the grass, the rain on the rivers, the sun on the ocean. There was only life, continuing as it had always continued, adapting and evolving and persisting. The earth turned, the seasons changed, and the rivers ran clean.